Welcome, everybody. This is my first of many podcasts from Cannes, and the one that is probably closest to my heart because it's a topic that we have been writing about and talking about quite extensively over the last 120 or so days. The brutal invasion of Ukraine and the public relations industry's response to that invasion. And I have here with me in Cannes three illustrious panelists who are going to help with the discussion. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Nataliya, why don't you start and tell us who you are and why you're here?
My name is Nataliya Popovych. I'm founder of One Philosophy. It's a Ukrainian consultancy, and I'm co-chair of Ukraine Communications Support Network, which is a union of public relations professionals and agencies around the world who are helping Ukraine's cause.
Hi, I'm Nitin Mantri. I'm the president for ICCO, and we've been working with Nataliya and other like-minded people to set up this Ukraine support network, communication support network. We have about 60-odd members, and many of them have become ambassadors, many countries, to come together to support a campaign around the invasion. I am also the Group C of AVNV. That's my other job.
And I'm Grzegorz Szczepanski. I'm from the neighbor country, Poland. Also representing PR profession of my country, but being also the member, like Nataliya, of the Ukraine Communication Support Network, trying to figure out what our professional colleagues could do in these times.
Let's start with you, Nataliya, and tell us a little bit about what you were looking for from the PR community at the beginning of this crisis, and what you've gotten and how satisfied you've been with the industry's support so far.
Thank you, Paul. Well, as you know, even before the invasion started, I appealed to a number of my colleagues across the industry within our network and broadly, trying to prevent it. I think I was hoping that maybe if we have put enough pressure on the governments before the invasion started, if Ukraine was armed better, if the calls to action sounded louder back then, we could have maybe prevented it. Unfortunately, the war started. No one could have prevented it at the time. And ever since, I think, the industry has been remarkably supportive. I'm very honored that David Gallagher has called me to help him co-chair the steering committee, and that so many eminent members of the PR community are contributing their time and energy and resources to help Ukraine during this brutal and unjust war. And I think all of our efforts are now focused on one hand, alleviating the pain of the people who suffer in Ukraine, but more broadly, I think it's building this understanding among the profession of how important it is for us as advisors to advise our clients to leave Russia and to isolate it and to ensure that it's weakened to have this aggression against Ukraine. And thirdly, I think to seek justice, because I think we've been unfortunately witnesses to so many war crimes in Ukraine that only justice can cure it, can heal it. And I think all of us are very much aligned that those voices for war crimes, they have to be heard more broadly, and this is what we are trying to do.
So I'd like to just stay with you for a minute and talk a little bit about that phase before the war started. You said that perhaps it could have been prevented. And it was interesting to me watching the build up to the war. I thought that there was quite a good job of taking away all of the excuses that Putin had for his invasion. So Putin would claim that there was an act of aggression, or that, and immediately, particularly American intelligence sources would say that didn't happen. This is the truth. We seemed to do quite a good job of taking away his excuses, and eventually, obviously, it didn't matter, and he went ahead anyway because he didn't particularly care whether he had excuses externally. Was there more, you think, that a coordinated communications effort could have done in terms of calling out disinformation and counteracting Russian propaganda in that phase?
I think the sharing of the intelligence was extremely important. Of course, it immediately kind of clarified who is doing what, and that Russia is an aggressor and is doing exactly what the U.S. intelligence was saying it would do. I think also there was another very important critical element that happened well just before the war, was the fact that the HQs of the media, of the global media, they started moving to Kyiv and Lviv and the Ukrainian cities, and I think this is critical, that they stopped broadcasting the situation on Ukraine from Moscow's perspective and Moscow's HQ, but actually moved and were on the ground. I think this was extremely critical to see the reality for what it is and to report on the truth. I think, unfortunately, only in February, only in January, all of the people, all of the global community started recognizing that this is the war that already is going on for 8 years, that we already have allowed Putin and Putin's regime and Russia to really manipulate the globalization, manipulate the openness of the financial systems to disinform with RT and Sputniks and have the influence over Western societies that it has had over them. So it was in a way kind of in a too late phase. Yeah. But I felt that it's never too late to take a principled position, and I felt that if we sooner rather than later want to create a zone of discomfort for Russia and to explain that what they're doing is not okay among the civilized community, stop working with them, stop representing them, alienating them from the organizations that are important to them, that could influence their behavior.
Right. I mean, I think what was interesting to me in that phase was that perhaps belatedly it became apparent that this Russian disinformation machine, which had been part of the annexation of Crimea 8 years before, had also been, the same disinformation machine was responsible for interference in the American election, for pushing the Brexit campaign in the UK, that there was a thread running through it of, Russian expansionism, and that all of it essentially was about trying to create a friendly environment for Russia to do what it wanted to do with Ukraine and presumably after Ukraine with several other former republics too. As a neighbor, and obviously you have both a geographic proximity to Ukraine, but you also have a sort of kinship and a brotherhood, I think, that has become apparent after the invasion, with the number of refugees that fled to your country. Did you see what was happening before the rest of us? Did you have an insight into this? Not just you personally, but sort of from Poland.
You mean
was
before
there
the 24?
more urgency in Poland than there was in the rest of Europe?
I think couldn't be barely a single Pole found who will say the war will not come. It was so obvious for us, the concentration of the armies. I mean, these signals we can decode pretty fast, being one of those countries from the post-Soviet bloc. So for us, it was just a matter when and what could be done. Of course, before the 24th, we were more focused on ourselves. And then when it started, the focus changed because, the situation is incomparable to Ukraine, to Poland. But yeah, I mean, we've been kind of prepared in terms of this brotherhood notion of the both nations, because I mean, Ukrainians, our friends, are very well present in Poland since many, many years. We can say that the level of accommodation is getting very fast. It's not like, I mean, even in the neighborhood where I live, it's quite a big proportion of Ukrainians. And they are assimilated the way you really cannot find, I mean, it's not like isolated groups. So for us, it was really easy to treat them never as refugees, but rather the brothers and sisters from Ukraine, which made all this much easier for all of us to stand. But I don't know if we could do anything more before. I mean, fighting with the Russian disinformation machine is really a difficult factor. An interesting observation we made, actually, there was the same disinformation groups in Poland that were used fighting with the vaccine. So one of our biggest clients was implementing the vaccination or the product in the Polish market, and we've been fighting this, and then we observed exactly the same groups are now spreading disinformation in regard to the war. So yeah, I mean, it's a difficult fight, but we know how to do it.
It is fascinating to me. I mean, this is as a student of the public relations business, it is fascinating to me how coordinated so much of the troubling disinformation around the world has been. You trace it back and back and back, and it all seems to originate from somewhere in the Kremlin one way or another. Nitin, from your perspective, from the eco perspective, when did this issue really sort of bubble up to the top of your agenda and become a priority?
I think before the war starting, I think Nataliya was having conversations with David, and I want to again compliment David for really stepping up and working with Nataliya to be the co-chair of this committee. So it started from there, and but I think we reacted very quickly as soon as the war started. The Ukraine Communication Support Network was set up. I think we've also learned along the way. We've started with a call to agencies to support, and we had a big interest from a lot of UK agencies. And then as we went along, we've realized that we actually need more intelligence in each country, and we need brand ambassadors. And over the last month or so, we've actually created brand ambassadors from each ECO member country. And these guys are on the ground to help us, one, fight misinformation, give us more media intelligence on what's happening in those markets, helping us also shape opinions in those markets, right, wherever we need to shape opinions. So yeah, so that's the way it was set up, and yeah, I think it's going really well now.
And so the Ukrainian Communication Support Network is not actually the first network that you've set up, right? I mean, many of you will know we awarded one of our Outstanding Individual Achievement Awards to Nataliya just a month or so ago. And recognizing the work that you'd done then, it was apparent to me that for the last 8 years at least, you have been balancing building what is, I think it's fair to say, the premier public relations and communications agency in Ukraine, with a lot of work on behalf of Ukraine, both domestically and internationally. So tell me about some of the work you've done on sort of the resilience and other issues for Ukraine over the last few years.
I think in 2014, for us, it was a pivotal moment, because I think the Revolution of Dignity was sort of the eye-opener for a lot of Ukrainians in terms of how we need to stand up for our freedom and democracy on a daily basis. And I think it affected us in our business in terms of how we have reconfigured, and one philosophy came up as a business to want to really, create reality we want to live in Ukraine, and that meant making Ukraine more resilient in so many ways, also to disinformation and to potential attacks. So we had to balance growing, but also making our country more resilient. And I think we tried to influence as much as we could, not just countering disinformation and fighting fakes, because as we know, it doesn't really work just fighting disinformation, but more working with the memory of Ukrainians and supporting the National Memory Institute in revamping the state calendar of what Ukrainians feel is their identity, to what extent they are ready to embrace and fight for freedom, to what extent we have institutions in terms of cultural diplomacy that help Ukrainians understand, who they are. We've supported a lot of the strategic communications reforms with different ministries and government in Ukraine, as they were reconfiguring themselves also as new institutions based on values of respecting human dignity and really engaging society in how Ukraine grows as a country. Unfortunately, we failed because we were not able to stop Russia. But at the same time, I have to say that I feel that the resistance you see today, that the resilience you see today, is partially because we do have the more critical mass of Ukrainians who understand who they are. To them, it's important to have their statehood, to have their language, to have their traditions, to be the protectors of freedom in our part of the world. And in that way, we're still fighting and we're contributing.
I mean, I do think it's fascinating that in some of the places in eastern Ukraine in particular, where I think Russians genuinely expected a friendly reception, they have found that even the people they hoped would be their allies had come to think of themselves as Ukrainians and had come to think of themselves as part of a separate country, and the resistance has been much stiffer than they anticipated. I'm sure the work that you've done and also just the fact that when you live in a democratic society, you don't particularly, no matter what your ethnicity or how you identify, want to go back to living in an absolutist dictatorship.
Absolutely, and even now with, after all of the bombardments, cities being shelled, what we see that 82% of Ukrainians are not ready for any concessions in the south and east of Ukraine in particular. I think that speaks of the fact that, freedom is like air. I always say, like yesterday there was this session about climate change, and everything changes. But to us, freedom is the air we breathe. So if we lose freedom, everything changes, and it doesn't make sense to live anymore. So.
I'm interested in just talking about the whole disinformation realm for a moment, because it seems to me that you have two issues side by side, right? Which is you have disinformation as a chronic problem, which is to say that we have allowed this to seep into our Western societies almost with our eyes closed. It just suddenly was everywhere, and it became part of the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter and everywhere else. It's also an acute problem in the Ukrainian instance, because this is the war for truth in this conflict is as important as any other part of the war. If we can't keep the spotlight on truth in the West, then support for Ukraine, whether spiritual or military, is going to draw up awfully quickly. So you have those two things to balance, and the fact that, not to make everything about public relations, but that is sort of my job, this is an existential issue for our industry, right? I mean, just across the board, if people can no longer distinguish between fact and fiction, between truth and fantasy, between information and disinformation, then we might as well all pack up and go home, because we're just throwing different noise out into a cacophony of awful sounds. So how are we as an industry, how is ICCO as a leadership organization dealing with that?
I totally agree, Paul, and I think
it's all on you, by the way.
Yeah, I know. I think two things, right? So firstly, personally, I think it's a great opportunity for us, right? Can we take this forward? Can we do something around it? And I've said this in the past. I think PR firms will start getting fact checkers, or should start getting fact checkers. I think, so far we are disseminating information, taking clients' information, working on it and putting it out, right? But there's a stage where we should come forward and say, okay, we've got fact checkers, this is wrong, and we need to put the correct stuff out there and call it out, right? And maybe work with fact checking firms, right? And there are many of them around, right? To your other point about disinformation is like an endemic, right, almost, but it has started from our governments, right? Yes. It started from top down. It actually did not start from somewhere, from a rogue person or something, right?
Well, okay. I mean, I don't want to call out the public relations. Yeah, I do. I do want to call out the public relations industry. So much of what you're seeing right now can be traced back. I mean, okay, so you could make the case Goebbels, Hitler, big lie, whatever, and that's all true. But the actual machinery of creating doubt, right, was pioneered by the tobacco industry. It was pioneered by the anti-climate change movement. It was in response to Rachel Carson and Ralph Nader, and it was this way of saying, well, yeah, we think you think that tobacco's bad for you, but there's actually this one doctor over here who thinks that it's really great. So it's still unsettled science. I'm not trying to get off topic here, Nataliya. I will come back to you, but this is, our industry and specific firms within our industry got very good at creating uncertainty around what should have been settled science. And that opened the door, it seems to me, for people to say, yeah, but there's a fascist unit in the Ukrainian army, so they're just as bad as the Russians, which is sort of like saying, there are 7 regiments in the American army, so they're as bad as the Nazis. I mean, but we've managed to create this climate where you can question anything, and you can do it under the guise of, hey, I don't want to swallow everything whole. I want to question everything. I'm a bit skeptical. And suddenly this idea of questioning authority, which is in itself not a bad thing, has been an excuse to say I don't believe anything anymore.
Yeah.
Sorry,
fair enough. But I think
here.
coming back to the war, I think there is something which is black and white and something which is gray, right? And I think the war is, I think the idea here for this network has been to make sure that this is seen as black and white, wrong and right? There is no gray area in this. Right?
Yeah, no, this is the first war I can remember since World War II where it was clear who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, right?
At least for us.
I think, you know, and I come from a country which is actually abstained, right? So in spite of that, I think if you go back and talk to people, and abstaining is for various other political reasons, so let's not go into that, but there is clear support that something's wrong has happened and it shouldn't have happened, right? So I think in this case it's very clear, and I think the job here is to make sure that misinformation is corrected at every stage for this war.
Well, yep. To what you said, I think it doesn't look as bad as we could think about the future of our profession, because all of what you said is true, but the kind of a testing moment that we have at the moment didn't appear since the Second World War, as you said. So it's really like you are reminding us, it's really black and white. It's very black and white for you on every aspect related to that. The further we go from the Ukraine this way, that maybe there is more grayish. But anyway, it's such a clear testing moment to all of us. I mean, do you want to continue really to put some uncertainty in the people's minds when something is really black and white? It's your choice. I think the correction is going to come pretty soon, and we will know who is like a true public relations professional, who is a propaganda master. I tend to differentiate these two professions. They go all together, but we have to distinguish the two.
I mean, to me, public relations is the opposite of propaganda. Right? They're not cousins, they're not brother and sister, they're not living in they are enemy, right? Propaganda is a manipulative transactional discipline. It is about fooling people into doing what you want them to do. Public relations is based on the idea of a relationship, right? It's right there in the name. Public relations is about how do we create an environment in which your interests as stakeholders align with our interests as an organization. And to do that, you have to create a relationship. And as I suspect everybody on this little table and in the audience out there understands, you can't build a relationship on lies. You can't build a relationship on fiction. You can't build a relationship on manipulation. So to me, there's a very clear contrast. I've never quite forgiven Ed Bernays, the quote-unquote grandfather of our profession, for writing a book in which propaganda was right there in the title, because it's created a lot of confusion over the years. But we have to be the enemies of propaganda. We have to be, the public relations has to be on the side of truth, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere.
But you talked about disinformation earlier, and I think over the last few years, at least I've noticed, I don't know if you've seen the same thing, but more and more agencies are moving, in my view, trying to differentiate between right and wrong and what to pick up and what not to pick up, right? I'm hoping that continues, and we've seen that with one of the big agencies coming under fire on climate change, on fossil fuels. Yep. We've seen the Bell Pottinger issue in the past. So those things are happening. People are calling.
They're going to continue.
They're going to continue. People are calling them out.
I want to stick with. We could go off into a philosophical discussion about truth, public relations, propaganda, and all of that, and that would be a fascinating conversation. Maybe we'll come back and do that again in the future. But let's go back to Ukraine and let's talk a little bit about the support network, and tell me a little bit. First of all, what are the practical things that the support network is and can do? And what's the call to action for the people watching this in order to get involved and make a difference and do something positive right now to help the Ukrainian case?
Well, I think it's very much connected actually to the, defending the territory of truth, if you will, because as I say, in Ukraine, truth is out there because the war is happening. So war makes things very, very clear to people. You know, it's hard to do propaganda in a country whom you're bombing. So that is very clear there. Unfortunately, we don't have territory of truth in Russia because they've created this war based on complete misunderstanding of who they are, what is their role in the world, and what they want to achieve. And unfortunately, the area of truth is grayish in some of the areas where people also not necessarily understand what is at stake. And I do believe that really much of the future of humankind is at stake in Ukraine. Like if we defend the freedom there, we defend freedom everywhere. If we don't, you know, collectively freedom and democracy and the free world loses. So success of Ukraine Communication Support Network will only happen if we are able to actually influence some of the harder markets. I'm not saying we're trying to influence Russia per se, but influence some of the harder markets, because for example, we see that in the countries of Global South, there is ambiguity. Russia, in their genocidal textbook of RIA Novosti, clearly said we're going to manipulate the former colonies. We're going to speak to our brothers in South Africa and Latin America and other places, because now it's us together against the West, and they're trying to frame it in a way in which we have to build more awareness in these countries that Ukrainian war is a war of independence. It's a war against empire that's been empire for too long, for 100 centuries, you know, for 100 years too long. So we need to go deeper, as Nitin had said. We have appointed and are actually calling for more ambassadors of UCSN in different markets. And in those markets, we can work with diaspora, with all pro-democracy and pro-freedom groups. We work with Ukrainian embassies sometimes. We build these kind of ecosystems of those who advance the same values that Ukraine is trying to advance. And we're inviting people to contribute, you know, media, space, to keep Ukraine's voice out of that fatigue of current summer and other priorities, you know, becoming on the table. We ask for all various events, you know, like this one or others, to give platform, you know, to discuss these issues. I'm just going to give you one example. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, they want to talk about food security, they want to talk about peace. We also want to talk about peace, but we want to talk about lasting peace. We want to talk about peace that's not going to be broken in another 3 months' time. So what are the preconditions for lasting peace to emerge there? So these are, you know, some of the very, very practical things that public relations professionals can do.
By the way, I mean, I do think in some parts of the world, particularly in the sort of sub-Saharan areas, the task has been complicated by the fact that the West treated refugees from Ukraine very, very differently, right, than it treated refugees from Africa and other places where there's been similar strife and turmoil. And I don't think that's been particularly helpful. Nitin, tell me some of the things that ICCO has put in place that are sort of hard, practical steps. And again, talk about how PR practitioners around the world can get involved.
Yeah, so you also talked about call to action. The first call to action really is, if you have not appointed an ambassador from your country, appoint one now, and join the network and help us, you know, just get more information out there, identify misinformation, and all that we spoke about earlier. To this question, Paul, I think we've identified these ambassadors. We are now putting in place on how they will work in each market. Identifying misinformation, working with consulates, local Ukrainian consulate, identifying groups, identifying events like Cannes to get a voice for the cause. We've already done lots of content partnerships, one with PRovoke as well, where lots of content is coming out. We're trying to see if we can do more and more webinars and on-ground events in different markets to lend a voice. So all that stuff is in place and happening as we speak.
What have been the priorities in your market? So
I think they are the same everywhere. I would even more practical. I would put it even more practical. If there is probably the biggest challenge now is how to maintain the relevance of Ukraine in our heads, in the news. I mean, see, summer is just around the corner. We will be going to the holidays, and we will be just disconnected from what is the everyday reality. So I will use the words of Jamala, the famous Ukrainian singer, who at the session, by the way, very great session of the creative colleagues from Ukraine. She said, "Use your own voice." I mean, we do have our own voice. We, as PR professionals, we have our groups, we have our bubbles, and simple what you can do, you just reach out to the subsite on PRCA or ICCO, and you can get some kind of tools. I mean, just use your voice, spread the truth within your own community.
It seems to me that there are two big challenges. First of all, keeping this story fresh and urgent, right? Because as you say, in the first couple of weeks, it was like, wow, plucky Ukraine has held out for 2 whole weeks. Well, now it's held out for 120 days, right? It's held out for what, 4 months, and it is. I don't see in my Twitter feed the same number of anecdotes about grandmothers shooting down drones or farmers rescuing tanks. I mean, that we need to keep stories
coming out
prominently. But the other thing that we've seen is that even in countries where there is a high level of support for Ukraine, that support is not necessarily translating into the kind of arms shipments, the kind of military assistance that President Zelensky has made it clear is his priority. And that raises some interesting questions for your organization and its members, which is, how much do you want to get involved in American domestic politics to urge them to help Ukraine with practical, weapons and aid, and how much are you just going to focus on, we've got to win the propaganda war, we've got to tell the stories, we've got to help out? When does this become a lobbying campaign?
Well, I think from my perspective, we need to be effective. And if we want to be effective, we need to remember that, yes, it's 120 days. And the only reason I'm here or any of my colleagues are here is so that we could convince more people to join UCSN and actually provide effective help. Because 100, maybe more soldiers from Ukraine dying every single day is because we have not been effective yet. That means that our voices have not been heard. And that is the reason that is happening. That also means that we have not convinced all of the bigger agencies and all of the international agencies to drop their clients or convince their clients to leave Russia. Because we know that there are still companies, international companies, who use the excuse of essential goods provision or whatever excuses to continue to pay taxes to the Russian Federation. Extractives, many of them have said they would stop doing business in Russia, but they continue to use all of the loopholes of the sanctions regime. And if Europe is continuing to pay $1 billion a day to the Russian Federation that kills up to 100 or more Ukrainian soldiers per day, something is missing in this logic. So we as communications professionals need to...
From your perspective, at some point, this has to become a lobbying campaign,
we have to explain that there is a price for freedom, and I'm really sorry that the price of gasoline went up, but freedom is priceless. If you lose it, you will not care for the price of gasoline. Nobody in Russia cares for the price of gasoline, but do they live in a free society? Would any American want to exchange life in the United States for a life in Russia where your life is just a statistic? You can be killed, raped, sent to prison, or deported, whatever happens right now with Ukrainians in the east of Ukraine. Unfortunately, nobody probably would want life like that. So this is what is at stake. And if we want to defend it, yes, we want to arm Ukraine. We want to isolate Russia and completely weaken its ability to fight the war. And then we need to address the top question, which I hope in a setting like you are providing, Paul, because I think you are always setting like sort of the, what is the challenge 2 days from now, 3 days from now, for entire profession. The biggest issue is, what do we do about the states, about political systems that want to influence others in a rogue way? What do we do about people whom we cannot democratize? How do we solve the problem of Russia as a neighbor to so many countries, not just Ukrainians who are now taking the heat, but to Poland, to Baltic states and others who do not feel safe? If Ukraine weren't there, I'm sure Poland would not feel safe, or Baltic states would not feel safe. Yeah. Imagine we lose, Yeah. So what do we do about the bigger issue of, disarming disarming nuclear states that are providing such huge issue?
Nitin, you mentioned earlier you come from a market that has remained neutral on this question. I mean, how comfortable are you as either ICCO or as an Indian member of ICCO in taking a position that confronts the Indian government a little bit more strongly on this issue?
But I've been very comfortable. So I've been leading from the front since the day it started. So the Indian government position is based on a lot of historical facts on why we are being neutral, right? So I don't, and it goes back to what Nataliya was saying. there's a lot of historical relevance where what America did and what the Russians did, and then, so we can keep debating that, but that's not important. And I think the Indian position has been that they don't want a war.
I will say that, and this is probably a very Western-centric viewpoint, it is ironic and bizarre to me that countries that have suffered under colonialism are either on the side of or at least neutral on the reimposition of an imperial government over a colonial system, right? I mean, I would have thought that Indians and Africans would be more outraged to see what's going on here than the rest of us, but I'm probably being overly simplistic.
The Indian situation is more to do with their defense needs, their neighborhood, and protecting their own at some level. We have 70% our defense equipment is from Russia. Because the Americans were busy arming Pakistan in the early 70s, because they wanted to protect Afghanistan from Russians.
Yes.
So this whole geopolitical situation is different. But the Indian position is very clear that they don't want the war. They want the war to stop. They've followed the sanctions what have been imposed by the UN stuff. So they're following all that. So it's not that they're not. But are they opposing in the UN in the sanctions? No, because they need to be seen as neutral. I think from just coming back to your earlier question, Paul, I think yes, the discussion, the network needs to move to the next stage of how do we influence the final outcome, right? Right now it's more identifying, pushing content. So do we go into a lobbying mode at some stage and into a larger issue or this issue? Yes, I think the answer to that is yes, it has to, because the war is just continuing. I don't see an end to it. Okay,
we need to, I think, probably wrap things up a little bit. So I'm just going to go quickly around the table here, and one final word from everybody about what's the most urgent need for our industry, and what do people need to get involved with. And we'll go that way so that I can give Nataliya the last word.
Yeah, I will come back for the second what Nataliya said. It's difficult to be a part of the lobbying campaign to everybody from our profession, because it's kind of a tiny part of our industry, but everyone is skilled in influencing commercial aspect of it. So it can start by saying, I will not work for this client who is continuing operations in the Russian market. I will advise, it's a ESG sport now. I will advise my clients if they would like to invest anything in like a social good, focus on what Ukraine needs now.
Yeah, I think just to Greg's point, I've said this earlier, like even in India as an agency, we've said no to all work that's coming from Russia for agencies, and they've come. They've asked us to represent clients, and we've declined. And most of the agencies are declining, right? I think my last word is just call to action. I think if you're not part of the support network, become part of the support network and help us, stop this misinformation
Use your voice.
campaign. Use your voice, absolutely.
Well, choosing ethical approach over profits now, I think, is the only way for our profession to survive. I think if anybody is looking to have a great agency or great consultancy of the future, now they have to refuse working with Russian clients, advise international clients, leave and divest from Russia, not be accomplices in war crimes, because this is the least people do. This is the least people can do. And yes, it may impact this year's profitability, but it will earn, I'm sure, the level of reputation and simply contribute to the world in which all of these future generations of consumers will want to live in. So this would, to me, is just basically practicing what we preach, being true to our word. Let's try to do that.
That sounds eminently reasonable to me. Yeah. And I hope everybody gets on board with that. I do want to thank all of you. Nataliya, you've for 9 years now been leading a communications effort that I think is one of the things that our industry should be most proud of in terms of making a real difference in the world. And while it didn't avert war, I think it's clear that the information war globally is being won by the right side. and that is in no small part down to the work that you've done over those years. Nitin, I think what ICCO's done to really get involved in this issue and take a lead is very impressive. I'm on record as being intensely skeptical of trade associations generally, but this is one example of leadership that I think the whole industry can get behind. And I thank you for your involvement on the ground in this issue, right there on the front line, as it were. And setting an example that I think the consultancy business across Europe and across the rest of the world should be following, and any small part that PRovoke can play in this to just bring people together and urge people to act. I'm delighted that we can help even in our own small way. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Great discussion.